The rain had been falling since midnight. Earl Dibbs woke up at 3:30 in the morning, the way he always did. Not from an alarm, not from noise, but from some internal clock that had been running since the Korean War, when sleeping past 4 meant cold food and angry men. He pulled on his boots in the dark, laced them slowly, and stepped outside into the Georgia mud. Fort Benning was quiet at that hour. Not peaceful. Ranger camps are never peaceful. But quiet in the way that places get when exhausted men are sleeping hard and the rain is doing all the talking. Earl walked to the field stove, checked the gas line, checked the water tank, checked the coffee supply the same way a pilot checks a cockpit. Not nervously, just carefully. The way a man checks things when he knows that getting them wrong will matter to someone else. He was 63 years old. He had cooked for soldiers since 1952. He had never once been issued a weapon, a rank, or a patch. He was a civilian contractor from Amarillo, Texas, and most of the Rangers he fed were young enough to be his grandchildren. They called him Pops. Not with affection exactly, not with disrespect either. It was the kind of name that lands on a man when he has simply been around long enough that something has to be called something. Earl did not mind. He put the water on and went back to checking things. The 24 Rangers who arrived at the forward camp that October morning had been in the field for 31 hours. 3 of them had twisted ankles. 1 had a gash above his left eye from walking into a branch in the dark that had been treated with medical tape and silence. All of them were wet in that particular way that happens when rain has had enough time to find every seam in your clothing. They came over the ridge in 2 loose columns and smelled the coffee before they saw the camp. Nobody said anything about it. This is something civilians misunderstand about soldiers who have been in the field for a long time. They do not always express gratitude with words. Sometimes gratitude looks like a man setting his pack down slower than usual. Sometimes it looks like someone staring at a tin cup for a second longer than necessary before drinking from it. Earl had learned to read these things a long time ago. He handed out food without being asked. He had been cooking since before they crossed the ridge and everything was hot. Eggs from a powder that he had learned to season so well that most men did not realize they were eating powder at all. Biscuits from a field recipe he had modified over a dozen years. Coffee that was strong enough to warrant a warning and never got one. The sergeant major, a man named Roy Dufresne, who was 41 years old and had the kind of face that suggested he had been 41 years old for most of his adult life, took his cup and stood at the edge of the camp looking into the tree line and did not speak to anyone. This was normal. Earl poured himself half a cup and got back to work. The trouble started in the early afternoon. A specialist named Thomas Garrett was the kind of soldier that training sergeants talk about in 2 completely opposite ways, depending on who is doing the talking. In the field, he was exceptional, aware, fast, careful with his equipment, never the man who slowed anyone down. Out of the field, he carried a short temper like a piece of kit he could not figure out how to leave behind. He was doing inventory. Soldiers in Ranger training do inventory the way other people breathe, constantly, automatically, because the cost of not knowing what you have is a cost nobody wants to pay in the field. He counted his cartridges, and then he counted them again, and then he set them on a flat rock and counted them once more. 1 was missing. He was certain of it. He was the kind of man who is always certain of things like this, and more often than not, he is right. He stood up and looked around the camp. Most of the men were resting. 2 were checking their boots. Dufresne was still at the tree line, still silent, still looking at something that was not visible to anyone else. Garrett said, at a volume that was not quite shouting but was clearly not interested in being private, that someone in this camp had his cartridge, and he would like it returned immediately. The camp shifted. Not dramatically. Just the way a room shifts when someone says something that everyone has decided to pay attention to without admitting they are paying attention. A couple of men looked at their boots. 1 looked at Garrett. Nobody moved. And then Earl Dibbs stepped out from behind the field stove. He was still wiping his hands on his cooking rag. He did this the way men wipe their hands on cooking rags when they have been working with their hands all their lives, not as a gesture, just as a thing hands do between tasks. He said, "I took it." The camp went completely still. Garrett turned around and looked at the old cook with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem that does not fit any category he has prepared for. Earl explained. His voice did not change. His pace did not change. He sounded the way a man sounds when he is telling you about the weather. He had been out near the perimeter wire before sunrise, checking the camp boundary out of an old habit from years of working in field conditions. He had found a cartridge in the mud, partially covered, sitting in a position where a boot coming down at the wrong angle could have caused a very bad morning for whoever's boot it was. He had picked it up. He had put it in his apron pocket. He had intended to find out whose it was when the unit came in, but the morning had gotten busy, and it had stayed in his pocket until this moment. He held it out in his palm. Garrett stared at the round sitting in the crease of an old man's hand. He did not take it right away, not because he did not want it, but because something was happening in his brain that required a second to complete. Around them, 23 Rangers had stopped doing whatever they were doing. Roy Dufresne had turned away from the tree line. Earl waited with the patience of a man who has spent decades standing next to hot stoves in bad weather, with no expectation that anyone would hurry for him. Garrett took the cartridge. He said nothing. The expression on his face was not anger anymore. It was something harder to name, something that lives in the space between being embarrassed and being grateful, and not knowing how to be either one out loud. Dufresne walked to the center of the camp. He was not a man who raised his voice when he wanted people to pay attention. He had never needed to. There was a quality to Roy Dufresne's movements when he decided something was going to be said that caused people around him to understand, without words, that something was about to be said. He called attention. 24 Rangers came to, not in a sloppy way, in the way that men who have been trained to their bones respond to a sergeant major who means it. Back straight, chins level, arms at their sides, completely still. For a civilian cook who was still holding a dish rag. Earl looked at the men standing at attention in front of him and appeared to have no idea what to do with this information. He was not a man who had spent time imagining being saluted. He glanced at Dufresne with a look that asked a question without asking it. Dufresne did not look back at him. He looked at his men. He said, "This is the only person in this camp who was thinking ahead of all of you today." He let that sit for a moment, the way experienced men let important sentences sit, not filling the silence with explanation, just letting it occupy the air until it settled. Then he said, "He is not a ranger. He has no rank. Nobody told him to walk the perimeter. Nobody trained him to identify unsafe field conditions. He did it because that is how he moves through the world. Think about what that means." He did not say anything else. He walked back to the tree line. Soon. This is the part of the story that does not photograph well. The moment where Dufresne called attention is the moment everyone remembers. There is even a photograph of it somewhere, taken by a training cadre officer, showing 24 soldiers at rigid attention beside an unremarkable man in an apron. That photograph has traveled, as these things do, across years and hands, and eventually the internet. But the part that mattered most happened 4 hours later, without any order being given, without any discussion between them, without anyone deciding that this was what they were going to do. The Rangers cleaned Earl's equipment before they cleaned their own. In a training environment where personal equipment is the physical measure of a soldier's discipline and commitment, where time after a field exercise is rare and valuable, where every man had his own gear in need of attention, they cleaned the old cook's field stove, his pots, his utensils, his storage boxes. They cleaned them methodically and without conversation. Whoever was finished with one thing moved to the next. Earl watched this happen from a folding canvas chair at the edge of the camp. He did not say anything. He did not seem moved in the way the story might require him to be. No tears, no speech, no moment where he spoke about what it meant to him. He just watched. When they were done, one of them nodded at him. Earl nodded back. That was the whole of it. Thomas Garrett was not a sentimental man. He expressed things through action when he expressed them at all. Before the unit broke camp the next morning, he left a half-open pack of cigarettes on the edge of Earl's stove. He did not leave a note. He did not look at Earl when he did it. He picked up his pack and got into formation and looked straight ahead. Earl found the cigarettes when he was cleaning up. He smoked one immediately. He put the rest in the inside pocket of his field jacket, which was where he kept things he intended to keep. Earl Dibbs worked as a contract field cook for Ranger training cycles for 2 more years after that October. He fed men who rotated through, trained hard, and left. He woke up at 3:30 in the morning and checked his stove, and checked his water, and checked his coffee supply every single time, in every weather, with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything. He retired in 1971 and went back to Amarillo. He took a job at a roadside diner on the edge of town called Marcy's, which was open from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. He improved the coffee within his first week, and the owner did not notice, and also did not argue with the customers who started coming back more regularly. He worked there for 11 years. He was not famous. He did not give interviews. He was not the kind of man who thought about himself in terms of stories worth telling. He thought about whether the eggs were cooked right, and whether the tables were clean, and whether the woman at the corner booth who came in every Tuesday needed her coffee refreshed before she asked for it. He died in 1984 at the age of 77. He left behind a brother in New Mexico, a collection of cast-iron cookware so well maintained that it was still being used 40 years later, and the kind of reputation that does not appear in newspapers. The photograph surfaced in the early 2000s, in a box of documents that a retired training officer was sorting through. It showed the camp, the trees, the gray October sky, and 24 soldiers standing at perfect attention. In the center left of the frame was a small man in a cook's apron, with a dish rag in one hand, standing with the mild, unbothered expression of someone who was waiting for water to boil. On the back, in blue ballpoint pen, someone had written, "Pops, only man here who had his head right." Nobody knows who wrote it. The handwriting is careful and small, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who believed words deserved to be placed correctly on a page. It does not matter who wrote it. What matters is that it was written and kept and eventually found its way into the light, not as a monument to something dramatic, but as a quiet record of the truth that the people who move through the world most usefully are very often the ones who were never trying to be noticed at all. They wake up before the sun. They check the things that need checking. They pick up what others walk past, and they hold it out, without ceremony, for whoever it belongs to.